And while I don't think that it's very possible for most of us to ever completely get rid of this ego, as long as we're incarnated into a human form, I do believe that it is possible for us to tame it and to make it less of a dominant force in our lives by no longer having such an important role placed on being right and making other people wrong. One of the ways to begin to work at treasuring your divinity is to practice being kind rather than being right in as many occasions as you possibly can. And you have lots of opportunities to do this on a daily basis. Thousands of them show up in little tiny interactions in virtually every place you go, with strangers, with your children, with your spouses, on the telephone, ordering something in a restaurant, whatever. There's always this part of us that is the ego that wants to be right, that wants to make the dust rise from the earth with your swagger. And after a while, you start noticing it. You start observing it. As your own ego becomes less and less of a dominant force in your life, you start to notice how much other people's ego is playing such a role, how much strutting there is, how much posturing there is, how much bragging takes place. You can see it in body language. You can see it in the way that people deal with each other. You can see it in lines at the grocery store. You can see it when you're trying to get your ticket straightened out at the airport, whatever it might be. There's this placing somebody else in a position of inferiority, and you are here to do this for me, and I'm more important than. And it isn't said that way, but it's sort of communicated. And you think to yourself that all of these people, I do it all the time, all of these people are nothing more than me in an earlier time in my life. That this is the way I was. I see it in my past relationships. I see it in the way that I dealt with my children years ago and the way that I deal with them now. I see it in noticing that it's easier now for me to be kind and to suspend being right. And I'm right almost all the time. But I no longer need to point it out, except for right now, of course. But the idea that even if you know that when you're talking to someone that they're completely wrong, if you can suspend the need to point it out and instead just say something kind back in response, if you can just practice doing that wherever you are, those are points towards treasuring your divinity. It's not about worshiping more. It's not about getting down on your knees and practicing somebody else's orthodoxy. It's not about fitting in. It's not about memorizing verses out of the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or whatever. It's not about that. It's about practicing being Christ-like rather than Christian. It's about practicing being Buddha-like rather than Buddhist. It's about practicing being Muhammad-like rather than Muslim. Muhammad said, don't even harm any tree that has a green leaf growing on it. If there's a green leaf growing on it, don't harm it. Practice that. That kind of love and admiration for humanity. Live as much as you can those principles. And all it amounts to is simply beginning a process of moving out of the lowest levels of consciousness. The lowest level of consciousness is ego consciousness. Ego, some have suggested EGO, is an acronym for edging God out. That as you edge God out of your life, what you have done is you have separated yourself from your divinity, believed that you are those 6 things, separate from everyone, separate from what you would like to attract into your life, separate from God, your reputation. You start believing that this is who you are, and you start living this way, and you look upon your divinity as something that is out there that you'll talk to on at the synagogue on Saturday or at church on Sunday morning or whatever. And you'll practice during certain days, like we call, at the end of the year, 30 days of fasting, and this makes me, closer to God and so on. To me, it's about applying the principles of moving past ego consciousness. And when I see conflicts between one group and another, men versus women, when I see conflicts between people who are older and people who are younger, when you see conflicts existing between people who have one color skin and a different color of skin, when you see conflicts between people who wear a robe versus those who wear a yarmulke, when you see all of these divisions, and there are just endless numbers of them that we pigeonhole ourselves into, they are still the cause of virtually all conflicts on the planet. We still are dividing ourselves. We don't understand that this is a round planet, and on a round planet, there's no choosing up sides. There are no sides.
Years ago, my wife and I were going through some personal difficulties. We were making a decision about whether or not we were going to stay together, very frankly. Everybody in a relationship, I believe, has these moments and times when there's a struggle and you've been together for a while and you're not certain whether this is the right path and you're thinking about these things and so on. And nevertheless, it was a very difficult time emotionally for both of us. And I can remember years and years ago, as we were going through this, what it did for me to be in that state. I became much more loving. I became much more concerned with other people. I became less concerned with the pettiness of so many things that you find yourself worked up about, because I had a different focus in my life. And I can remember thinking, as we resolved it and got back closer together, and today are very close and very loving together, looking back on that time as like something that I had to go through at that time. And that what it did is it helped me to see how absurd it is for us to be focused on the minutia of life. Whether or not the walls are clean, or whether or not the toys are put away, or whether or not your food is prepared on time, or whether somebody is late with something, or whether the phone doesn't ring or does ring or whatever. Like, all of those things are so minute in contrast to what you're really struggling with. And then what it also helped me to do in terms of getting this big picture was to look at some of the things that other people were going through, some of the problems and difficulties that they were having. Very often when something goes wrong in somebody else's life that we're close to, one of our parents gets ill, there's an accident of some kind. When Marilyn had that accident, I can remember how it affected me. And it gives you pause to remind yourself that you have a lot to be thankful for, and that you have a very powerful mind here that can make anything happen that you want to happen, as long as you keep yourself centered or keep yourself focused. I was able to shift from all of those petty little things. And I look back on that now and I think, well, that's what I had to learn. That's what it was for, that there's a purpose in everything, and that perhaps one of the things that I had to learn 8 or 10 years ago was how to be more compassionate. And perhaps the only way I was going to learn how to be more compassionate was to have to go through some of this stuff myself. So, like, you can do that. You can do that now in your own life. Know that there's a lesson in this for you. Know that there are no accidents in this perfect universe. And know that the deep troubles that you may be experiencing or may be hard for you have something in them for you. And that there's a secondary purpose to them. And if it does help you to slow down, and if it does help you to get a bigger picture, and it does help you to be more compassionate and more loving towards other people, then what you do is you begin to bless those things that are in your own life as offering you an opportunity to transcend them. And once you've transcended them, then you don't have to go back to that again. And for sure, my wife and I do not have to go back to ever doubting whether we want to make it and whether we want our family to stay intact and whether we want to stay loving and so on. We don't ever have to question that again. We've been there, and we both learned how to look within. And when you do look within, to be grateful for what this person is offering you. So that every time I think about my wife behaving in a way that I don't like, or vice versa, we've learned how to zip it. How to just not make ourselves miserable by saying things and by doing things that will just create more difficulties. Because we've been on the edge. We've been to that edge, and we've looked over the edge and seen what it's like to maybe have to raise a family as a single parents or whatever, and to be without each other. And now we're a tremendous source of strength to each other instead of looking for the things that we don't like. So the way to the big picture often is through seeing the problems in your own life from a different perspective. And you begin to say to yourself, all right, how can I apply the awareness of these thoughts and how I use my mind to make my life all that I want it to be? to bring into my life the things that are important to me, to improve the quality of my relationships, to have the success and so on that I think that I'm entitled to. And it's really getting to the point where you know that every thought that you have has a potential for coming into your life, coming into form. You start to get real cautious about having anything in your mind that isn't going to work for you. And you begin to question why you would keep any of those thoughts in you. I can remember one story of a woman who came to me one time and told me how miserable she was, that she was married to a drunk. And I said, well, what's wrong? And she said, well, he slurs his words and he repeats himself and he smells bad and it's just awful to be around him. And I said, let's see if I understand. Let's see who's crazy in this little scenario you've just described. Now, you said you've married to a drunk, and the drunk slurs his words and he repeats himself and he smells bad and he sounds foolish. I said, that's every drunk I've ever known does exactly that. We got a drunk who's acting and doing everything that you would expect a drunk to do. Now we got you. And you're married to someone that you call a drunk, and you're expecting him to be sober. You know, now who's crazy? The drunk who's doing what he's supposed to, or you who's expecting someone who is what you've defined him to be something different than what they are? He is what he is. And why would you want to entertain, why would you want to keep thoughts in your mind that are making you miserable, which is going to expand misery for you in your life by just having those thoughts there? Why not change around those thoughts and tell yourself that you're, like, if you argue for your misery, then the only thing you're going to get is your misery. You have to get that, and you're arguing for it all the time. You're going around talking about how miserable you are. So you want to get real careful about that. And I suggest to every one of you that whatever it is you find yourself incapable of doing, or whatever you found that has been a great obstacle, or whatever it is that's in a relationship that isn't working, that you just can't seem to transcend, or whatever's going on with a particular employee or a way that you're approaching anything in your business, that if you examine, just for a moment, if you examine what belief is it that supports this behavior, because the ancestor to every action is a belief, is a thought, and then work at re-examining that. I hope it is as obvious to you as it is to me that the collective ego will benefit when we transcend our individual egos. You, as a single individual, have a sacred quest. That quest involves coming to your higher spiritual nature and inviting it to show you the way of the sacred self in your daily life. This means denying the demands of your ego if those demands contradict the guidance of your higher self. Our world is a collection of individuals urged on by the loving presence within all of us to achieve the sacred quest personally and collectively. The world will become a peaceful, fulfilled, cooperative, loving, truthful, tolerant, and pure environment as the individual parts that make up the collective consciousness restrain their egos. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. The whole behaves precisely as does its individual parts. Many people I speak to tell me that they feel powerless to affect the global community. They believe that, given the scope of the world's problems, their efforts are so infinitesimal as to be insignificant. They simply are not seeing that it is precisely through a change in individual consciousness that the world will be transformed. All of the problems that we face as a group reflect those we have individually. The world is encountering a spiritual deficit that reflects our need to consciously get on the path of our sacred quest. The solution to individual and global problems is to overcome the spiritual deficit. When you make the shift in consciousness, allowing yourself to be an agent of heightened awareness, you are contributing to the transformation of our world. You are not separate from the other souls on this planet. You share the identical energy that embodies the souls of Rwanda and Pakistan, for example. You are the lamp, and God is the electricity. It flows through you as surely as it flows through all living things. When you make the decision to choose the guidance of your higher self over your false self, you have plugged into the divine inner energy. When you run your life based on the principles of the higher self, you are contributing to the transformation of the entire world. You must strengthen your will to choose the sacred path when your ego calls you a fool for believing there could ever be a world without war. If your ego can convince you, you will become part of the collective ego's falseness. Individuals who choose ego propaganda are individuals who will build more bombs and manufacture more weapons. Currently, there are some 6 billion people on the planet. About 3 million are at war or in skirmishes that cause them to kill and torture each other. But that means that there are 5,997,000,000 who are not at war. This is a hopeful statistic, which our egos do not want us to consider. By contrast, the collective ego strives to keep the populace nervously on the edge with reminders to view the world in terms of us versus them. This ego viewpoint not only reinforces the insane escalation of ways to kill each other, but is also responsible for most of our social problems. The world ego is our false self, and this is the primary characteristic that we need to recognize. We want to believe that we are our physical bodies, and that the territories we occupy are so important that we are willing to kill each other in order to maintain those boundary lines. We have become convinced that our true identities are located in tribal ancestries, traditions, histories, genealogies, and the color and shape of our bodies. We have lost sight of our authentic identities because of the labels that our egos have assigned to us. Our egos have coalesced into a worldwide false perception of ourselves based on an unwillingness to know our true spiritual nature. Although all of our spiritual leaders have reminded us of our divinity and implored and even commanded us to love one another, the world ego has won this battle and produced ancient enmities and uncountable horrors in the long history of humanity. As you travel the path of your sacred quest, you will help to dispel the absurdity of specialness that the ego so assiduously promotes. You will see an end to this kind of thinking in your life and on a worldwide scale as well. The higher part of ourselves that I have talked about on this tape reacts to a vision that is infinite. This is assuredly not the vision of the ego. The ego is just as cowardly on a collective scale as it is on an individual basis. The world ego is frightened of a mass appeal to overcome our spiritual deficit. When people face inward and embrace a more loving perspective, the power of the sacred self will create change not only in the community but in the entire world as well. The world ego will do all that it can to prevent this kind of inner approach. It will ridicule those who promote meditation, peaceful demonstrations, and the love of God as a way out of the morass of social evils. It is just as true on the collective level as it is on the individual plane. The higher self urges you to simplify and to avoid contributing to anything that hurts others or increases the separation from your spiritual source.
When Madame Blavatsky talked about who the leaders of the spiritual revolution would be, she said that these leaders will be ordinary people, regular, everyday folks, school teachers, musicians, artists, cab drivers, regular folks. And these people will speak out with a voice. And this voice will be heard. And then the bureaucracies will fall in line and begin to reflect what it is that this consciousness is instituting in our people. And if you look at the people who have been instrumental in changing consciousness in the last 25 years, you look at the people whose programs you listen to through Nightingale Congress and ask what are their backgrounds. You find out that they're salesmen. Marianne Williamson was a singer, a nightclub singer. Louise Hay was a dancer. Dennis Waitley was a salesman. Zig Ziglar was a preacher. People who just did everyday, regular things. I was a school teacher. And somehow there's a power, there's a pressure, there's something that has come and put us in a position of just talking about this kind of shift, this kind of consciousness. Let me share with you from my heart. I have 6 daughters and 2 sons, but I have a 16-year-old daughter, the only child that we have, who has taken a different path in her life. And we've struggled with it. And she has, she had a very serious automobile accident. She had to be cut out of the car. She has taken a path of drinking and experimenting in drugs and so on. And I know that this is a path, and it's a very painful path, and she's had some very difficult times with it. And she's got a whole thing about authority and doing things her own way and so on. And I understand it, because I've lived it my whole life. And every time I must say that in the last 3 or 4 months, there's been just incredibly dramatic shifts in our life. And it's because there has been a shift in how I and my wife are dealing with this. And I used to, when I would think about her, I would be filled with rage and filled with pain. And I would be tearful and I'd be angry at the dumb choices that she would make and the things that she would do that just didn't seem to make sense. And I don't know if you've raised teenage daughters, but I saw a wonderful title for a book about raising teenage daughters. It said, Get Out of My Life. That was the title. But first, drive me and Cheryl to the mall. All right? It's a great book, by the way. And so I would be in my mind, and I'd be thinking about it, and I would try meditating, and I'd try working on it, and so on. And nothing seemed to work. And then I began to study this Foundations of Mysticism, this series of lectures by Joel Goldsmith, this great healer, lived back in the 1950s, wrote the Parentheses in Eternity in the Infinite Way. Wonderful, wonderful readings. He was a Christian Scientist and a very big supporter of chiropractic as well. And he talked about how we nullify disorder, disease, disharmony, and so on. And that, a reminder, the spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. These words that I say unto you are spirit. And he said, getting down on your knees and asking God to heal you, or getting down on your knees and asking God to grant you abundance where scarcity resides, getting down on your knees and asking God for anything is a foolish mission. Because the assumption behind asking God to give you something is that God already has it, but he's holding it back. He said, Luke 15:31 says, all that I have is thine. It's all yours already. And you are already connected to all that I have. And God, he said, isn't going to be doing anything different 1 hour from now than God is doing now. And God isn't going to be doing anything different an hour from now than God was doing 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. God is the infinite now. Don't assume that God is a withholding God. If I had the keys to healing you, to giving you abundance, to giving you a great relationship, to providing a job for you, whatever it is that you would like, and I held it all back unless you begged for it or obeyed the rules that I said you must obey, you would say, you know, you're really not even a very nice person, let alone a very nice God. He said you must know that you're connected to it already, and that the disease, the disharmony, the discord will be nullified, will be wiped out when you bring spirit to it. And as I would think about my daughter and the rage, I would feel myself as I was plugged into the physical, the laws of the material. And I would, in my own mind, I would unplug myself from the material, and I would plug myself into God. It's a wonderful mental image when things aren't going the way you would like them to go. Just unplug yourself from the laws of the physical, especially where there's disharmony, disorder, disease, and plug into God. And what you do when you plug into God is you bring love, you bring pardon, you bring hope, you bring joy, you bring fulfillment to that, and you correct the error, and it's gone. I had a friend who was diagnosed with cancer and told that she had just a few months to live. And she knew that she was in disharmony. And she didn't even tell her parents. She didn't tell anyone. She knew what she had to do. She had read all the spiritual literature. She had immersed herself in meditation and deep prayer. But still, she was surrounded by and contaminated by the energy field of those who were living in fear and without faith. And she left and she rented a cabin up in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin. And she went there all alone. And in the process, what she knew she had to do for 8 to 10 hours a day, every day, was to just reconnect to her source. And in the process of doing this, of just communing with God and just bringing peace, she came back from there a cleansed and whole person. and a healed person as well. It is in the bringing of spirit to disease. And that's why I say, and said to you at the very beginning, you must be operating at a different level.